I don't know how to recognize any terrorists. That's not my job, but we're sort of, guarding the periphery, and we have the special intelligence soldiers who are there to make sure no terrorists take advantage of this humanitarian step. So we see everyone walking by, and the women and children are going through, obviously, and also even fighting age males who are just non-combatants. And something that came up a lot with people in my unit, or something that hit them very hard, was seeing kids who are the same age as their kids.
Welcome to this episode of Shoulder to Shoulder, a podcast where a pastor and a rabbi get to the heart of issues that matter to people of faith. I'm Pastor Doug Reed here with my friend, Rabbi Pesach Wolicki. And on this episode, we're going to be having a conversation with Mayor Wolicki. And I'm so excited. Pesach's son is on with us. We've had Pesach's dad on before. My family's been on before, but we're getting to know the family. This is good, Pesach. I'm excited. But before we jump into that conversation, please like our Facebook page and join our Facebook group, the Shoulder to Shoulder community, where you can interact with me and Pesach all week long. The best way to support this podcast is to go on over to Patreon, subscribe to Shoulder. For just $10 a month, you're helping us bring this message of Shoulder to Shoulder to more and more people all around the world. As a thank you for your $10 subscription, you'll get exclusive access to chapter-by-chapter Bible study beginning in Genesis chapter 1 from Rabbi Pesach and myself. So go on over to Patreon, subscribe to Shoulder for just $10 a month. We're grateful for our sponsor, Israel 365 News, which is the place for you to go and get your news and information before going to anyone else. Go on over to Israel, the number 365news.com, and be sure to check out some of their articles and read Rabbi Pesach and my columns. Pesach, each and every week, we support some incredible products and initiatives coming out of Israel 365. What are we supporting today?
We are supporting a very specific family. There was a woman by the name of Ronit Elimelech, with 44 years old, a volunteer EMT, first responder, and a loving mother to 3 children, 2 of them on the autism spectrum. And on March 1st, 2026, on the second day of the war with Iran, a ballistic missile struck the synagogue shelter in Beit Shemesh, where her family sought safety. Ronit stayed behind to help her mother walk out, her mother who was moving slowly. Neither of them made it. And today her husband Nissim is facing the ultimate crisis, raising 3 traumatized children alone after losing their mother in an instant. And we have a special campaign at Israel 365 Charity to help the Elimelech family. Every penny goes to help them. Your gift covers what Nissim is having trouble covering: housing costs so his children don't lose their home after losing their mother, food and groceries, utilities, clothing for the 3 growing children, therapy appointments, and there are a lot of needs. So we are helping the Elimelech family, helping out Nissim, who has become a single father after his heroic wife was killed in a ballistic missile attack. So go to Israel365charity.com, Israel365charity, spelled it out as one word, .com. Scroll down to current projects, and you'll see the second project in the list currently is Help Nissim Hold His Family Together. Let's step up and help this family in Israel.
So important. Shoulder to Shoulder listeners, go and do what you do, and let's give to this family today. Pesach, you are back in Israel. You are home, but you were in the States. I was watching you bounce around. You were with a few friends friends of mine. You were down in Texas with our friend Stephen Martin. Love Pastor Stephen, his church. And you bounced around, but you had a traveling companion with you.
Yes.
Did you enjoy having your son with you?
It was unbelievable. I mean, we're going to get into that in detail in this episode. But first, let me just give you the rundown of what we did on the trip. Especially ever since we moved to YouTube, Doug, I have to say that we have grown this audience exponentially. I mean, it's really been incredible. The sheer number of people who are now part of the Shoulder to Shoulder conversation, the Shoulder to Shoulder family, has just increased so much. So I want to just give a little bit more background, make sure people understand that I travel to the U.S. about 6 times a year, sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less. And I travel all over America, and I speak and I build bridges between the Jewish and Christian communities, speak in Jewish communities, speak in Christian communities. On this trip, this was a very short trip, a 1-week trip. And for the first time, I was I was joined in the work on the trip with one of my children. My son, Mayer, who traveled with me this time 10 years ago, also traveled with me on a trip, but then he was just a high school graduate and was along for the ride. We went to a lot of baseball games that time. And in fact, we were in Youngstown, Ohio. I spoke at Bridge of Hope on that trip. It was the first time I ever spoke at Bridge of Hope. It was 10 years ago, a little more than 10 years ago.
2016.
That's right. But Mayer was with me this time, and he joined me. And anyone who goes to the YouTube channel, to Rabbi Pesach Wolicki, the channel that this podcast also appears on, and you scroll back to a few days ago, we posted a video of Mayer's message that he shared at Stephen Martin's church at Vintage Church in Harker Heights, Texas. And Pastor Nate Brown was there, and he sends his warmest regards to you, Doug, another good friend of ours.
Love Pastor Nate.
And I also want to give a shout out to young Judah on the staff of Vintage Church, who is currently, as we're recording this, landing in Israel on an Eagle's Wings Young Leadership Trip. And I want to give a special shout out for any of our listeners in Lake Charles, Louisiana. And I know we have them there at Todd Schumacher's church at Church of the King. And also mention that Caleb Bigwood, son of Pastor Josh Bigwood from Church of the King in Lake Charles, Louisiana, is also on the Eagle's Wings leadership trip. And let me also add, once we're talking about the fact that Eagle's Wings is, I think it's so important. For so many years, Eagle's Wings has been taking pastors on trips to Israel, and now they're really expanding, the Eagle's Wings message, which is, in my opinion, the most effective message at taking Christians, young Christians, like Doug Reed 10 years ago, and opening their eyes to what God is doing with the land and nation of Israel. And now they are bringing young leaders in large numbers. And we're also launching a partnership between Israel 365 and Eagle's Wings for the Shabbat programming on the Eagle's Wings trips. And this is going to be the pilot of that is going to be this trip. These young men and women, I believe, is it a mixed trip or is it only men?
It is mixed.
It's young men and women on this trip. They are going to be spending a Shabbat in Efrat, a Friday night dinner where they're going to be divided up among families. The entire trip is going to be going to different families in the Jewish community of Efrat in the hills of Judea for Friday night dinner. And that is being coordinated and organized on the ground by Israel 365. And it's a really natural,
cool.
It's a natural partnership between Israel 365 and Eagle's Wings. I like to think that the Shoulder to Shoulder podcast had something to do with that.
Come on.
Anyway, so there's a lot of exciting things going on there. So we visited Stephen Martin's church, and that was the first time Mayer ever spoke in a church. My son Mayer, who we're about to meet, don't worry. Everyone's on the edge of their seat. Mayer's coming in soon. We're going to meet him. And Mayer spoke in that church. And then, and of course, I spoke in the church as well. We then were in Dallas for an important event with American Jewish conservatives, where we had an evening. There were a few hundred people who gathered together. The great Ben Gershon from American Jewish Conservatives sponsored this event, hosted this event, and I was one of the panelists talking about the Iran situation, the Iran war, and it was very well attended and a lively, well-informed crowd was there. We then flew off to Washington, D.C., where we spent Shabbat at the Grand Hyatt Hotel with a group of young leaders. Some of them are currently students. Some of them are no longer students, but young leaders, mostly Christians, some Jews as well in the crowd, spending a weekend talking about advocacy for Israel, the challenges, brainstorming solutions. I led a Shabbat dinner, included in the Shabbat there. We got a chance to hang out over the course of the whole weekend with Shabbos Kestenbaum. Many people in our audience probably have seen him around. A very important young voice.
He was with us in D.C. back in May.
In the conservative movement. Yeah, that's right. He spoke at the Advocacy Day. So we spent Shabbat with him, or Shabbos with Shabbos, Shabbat with Shabbos. It was a lot of fun there in D.C. And we got to know a lot of the students there. We had wonderful conversations. And then we drove up to Philadelphia after Shabbat, and we went to the Potter's House, a church that is pastored by Pastor John Overson, a pastor who I met at a Shabbat dinner a number of months ago. And this was the first time there was ever someone like me in this church. I brought the message, and it was a wonderful church out in the Drexel Hill area of Philadelphia. And then we made our way back. We made our way back to Israel. It was a quick trip. We hit a few churches, had some meaningful time in Washington, D.C., and I just landed earlier today, and that's why we're recording a day late. If everyone who was waiting, where's my shoulder to shoulder? That's why we're a day late. We had some technical issues with the hotel internet, but here we are. And look, I have to just reflect before I bring my son in, Doug, that Jewish-Christian relations for me it's not just like, oh, this is this weird career choice. It really is, when I pray 3 times a day, when I say the words, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad," I think every single time about what Rashi, the greatest and most, I don't know what to call him, most prominent, most authoritative biblical commentator in Jewish tradition who lived in the 11th century, his commentary on that verse is that Moses said to the people of Israel, "Hear, O Israel, listen up, Israel. Right now, standing on the banks of the Jordan 3,300 years ago, the Lord is our God. But one day the Lord will be the one God over all." And that means that everyone's together. As Isaiah said, that that the temple in Jerusalem is a house of prayer for all nations. And that means that the goal of the covenant of Israel from Sinai is to bring faith in the God of Israel to all the peoples of the earth. And there's no greater expression of that, of nations of the world having faith in the God of Israel, and no greater expression of that vision that Moses articulated than Christians who are supportive of Israel, who are shoulder to shoulder, as this podcast is called, or one shoulder with the nation of Israel at this time. So to me, that's where I live spiritually, Doug. That's where I live theologically. So to have one of my children, to have my son, and we've talked about these matters, for years already between us, but to have him say, "Hey, I'd like to get involved in this. I'd like to contribute how I can to this great cause," to have him come along with me and join me in some churches and experience what I do, because all of my travel that I do, Doug, I'm by myself, and to have one of my kids along with me,
sure,
it was very meaningful. It was a very special trip for me. I can't even describe it. I don't have words. Everything I do is exciting and interesting and inspiring, but to do it with my son was just the next level.
That's incredible, and I can't wait till my boys are a little older and I get to do some of the things that I do with them. I've gotten to
you're moving to Israel.
We are, but I got to bring my son to DC and got to do some things, and my kids are sharing at the churches we go to. But it's very unique for them to get to a place where they're picking to come alongside. Our kids are still young enough; they don't have a choice. They're coming whether they like it or not. But for your son to choose to do this, I think speaks of the call on his life, your life, the inspiration behind it all, and I think it's special. And so let's, why don't you introduce your son, and we'll jump into the conversation.
Absolutely. So Mayor Wolicki is my son, my oldest son, the second of my 8 children, and he he holds a degree in philosophy from Hebrew University. He has spent over 500 days since October 7th serving in various combat situations as an infantry soldier, moved up to the rank of Sergeant First Class. He's a squad leader in the Givati Brigade in reserves, and I don't know what else to say about him. He'll let you know about his journey. Mayor, welcome to the Shoulder to Shoulder podcast.
Happy to be here.
It's awesome to have you on. So I have to ask, you said before we were on, you've come back and forth to the United States, but you've been raised in Israel. This trip to the United States, did you notice anything different in the U.S.? Did you notice any atmosphere stuff that was different? What stood out to you this trip to the U.S.?
So it's a good question. There were definitely a lot of things that stood out. Mostly, first of all, what I was doing there. The previous times I was in the States, I wasn't there to speak in churches. And also, it was a part of America I'd never been to before. I'd been to the East Coast a whole bunch of times. Also, I grew up in a neighborhood in Israel with a lot of Americans, but that's mostly, Jews from New York, Jews from New Jersey. And then suddenly to get to the middle of Texas and just, it's a different America.
It's another country.
Yeah.
No, it's so incredible. So this was your first time ever in churches, or had you been in a church before?
I mean, I'd never been in a church in this type of context. I guess 10 years ago, as was mentioned before, I sort of tagged along, but I was sort of a spectator. So this was the first time I was actually paying attention and contributing, I would say. So it was really a new experience.
So what stood out to you? What was the highlight? What was something that made you go, wow, that's interesting? Or was there anything that was uncomfortable?
So I would say, I think the most interesting thing about it was how interesting it was. And what I mean by that is that, most of our lives, most people spend all their time with people who are of a similar faith to them or with a lot of similarities. And it's just very interesting, especially for the first time, to go to a new part of the world or a new states, for a new reason and to meet a new kind of person. So even without all the theological stuff and why this is important and why we do it, just that be able to have such an interesting experience, that on its own is amazing. And
go ahead.
Yeah.
Keep going.
Yeah. And just to get, to the matter itself, I think once again, before getting into why this is all important, it's also just the positivity. Like, I felt so welcome and so happy to be there and so inspired, and the energy in the room and everyone I interacted with, it was the same. And that's what I expected. It wasn't like I was expecting it to be weird or anything, but just to have that much positivity in a situation is also something that it's just very special. We don't get enough of that.
Oh, I want to add in another interesting experience that we had there. So a while back on this podcast, we hosted, and we actually hosted this program a number of times. We hosted Judy Elias. This goes way back to the early years of the Shoulder to Shoulder. Judy Elias is the founder of a program called Heroes to Heroes, which is a program that brings combat veterans, U.S. combat veterans, mostly who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, on a spiritual healing journey that culminates in a trip to Israel. And there have also been a number of episodes where we've interviewed alumni of the Shoulder to Shoulder program, soldiers who've been through the program over the course of the years of this podcast. I think there's probably about 3 episodes or 4 episodes that we've devoted to to Heroes to Heroes. And part of the Heroes to Heroes program, and the program is actually just winding down now. It's been a while since there were American combat vets. Well, it's been a while since there were American combat vets, because Iraq and Afghanistan is moving further into the past, and it's kind of been time for that program to wind down. It's been a very successful program, but over the last year or so, I introduced Meir to the Heroes to Heroes program because Meir himself is a combat veteran. And part of the way they've run those trips to Israel for these again, American, not Jewish combat veterans who come to Israel on this spiritual journey. Part of what they do in the program is they bring Israeli combat veterans to participate in the trip, so that from when the Americans land in Israel for the duration of their trip, their week and a half trip or so, there are Israeli combat vets who are part of the trip with them. And they develop very close relationships, very close bonds of friendship. So Meir was on a Heroes to Heroes trip recently as one of the Israeli combat vets on the trip.
Oh, very cool.
Developed some friendships. But get this, 3 of the vets who were on that trip drove out to Harker Heights to hear Meir speak the first time he was in a church, and they were there present in the crowd.
That's super cool.
Meir, why don't you talk about the what you experienced there? Because when you went out to Harker Heights and you spoke there, you already had in your background some time spent with Christians, with other combat veterans, with Americans who aren't Jews from the Northeast, that you experienced on Heroes to Heroes. Talk about how that experience maybe helped prepare you or was part of, or maybe the same experience of discovery as the trip we just took.
Yeah. So just to frame the timeline here, I was on this trip with American Army vets around a month ago. So that's only a couple weeks before this most recent trip of me going to the States to visit churches. So basically back to back. And on the trip, because we're all Army vets and that was primarily what we were dealing with, so it's a lot of talk about different experiences in the Army and how we process those things and how we process other things in our lives. But what was most significant to me about that trip was interacting with people of faith that don't share the same faith as me. Because the program isn't just centered around the military and trauma and ethics, it's primarily faith-based. That's why the program visits Israel. So we were having all these very, very deep discussions about reconnecting to our faith and reaffirming our faith and reconnecting to God. All these discussions, all while I'm a Jew, and there was another Jew there, so a couple Jews and a whole bunch of Christians. And it really hammered home that there's so much here that we have in common. And a lot of the messaging about reconnecting and taking our faith seriously and what we want the world to look like and what our faith is about, a lot of that stuff is really in common. So getting to see that in these one-on-one conversations or this group setting really hammered home the messaging of the much larger scale work that people do in the general world of Christian-Jewish relations. So I got a little snippet of it and I really felt that energy, and I saw like, hey, there's really a lot in common here. This isn't trying to build some really long bridge over a really big gap. The gap isn't as big as we think. And when we can connect over that small gap, it's really powerful.
I think you said earlier that, there's the energy, the people, all of that, and you started to dabble in there. There's also the theology and that sort of component of it. What brings you to the table theologically? Your dad and I've talked about theology all over the spectrum, all different conversations over the last decade. And so I know a lot of his thoughts on this, and he's shared in the churches I pastored. What brings you to the table other than, all right, I had some personal experiences, but what about your relationship with God and your understanding of Scripture brings you to the table to say this is a valuable thing to do?
Yeah, so a lot of that stuff, it goes way farther back than the past month. It's not like I was on this program a month ago and it was this great awakening and it, structured a whole worldview, rapid fire, and then I went and visited some churches. A lot of this stuff goes a lot farther back. I spent, after high school, I'm 28 now. So a decade ago, after high school, I went to seminary. I spent 3.5 years there, spent a lot of my time studying the Bible and Jewish theology. Then when I went on to study philosophy, my main focus wasn't figuring out what this philosopher said or that philosopher said. It was really trying to figure out what I should be saying and what I should do and how that ties into my faith. And that's why the sides of philosophy that interest me most are the sides that do connect to my faith. And so I've really, since I finished high school, whether it's in the seminary or in university, I basically spent all my time dealing with these issues and really trying to structure my worldview, both from a faith perspective and from a general perspective. Now, if we go farther back than that, unsurprisingly, my dad is my dad. I've learned a lot from him. So there's a lot there that I didn't have to invent the wheel as much as I would have if he wasn't my dad. So that's obviously a resource I've used a lot, but I've also gone on a journey of my own and really tried to figure out what does it mean for me to be connected to God, and what does it mean for me to be a Jew? What are the Jews all about? What are we as a group? What am I as an individual? So this is stuff I've really been doing full time for a while now. It's not a job, but it's an occupation.
Meir, you just raised the issues of identity. You just said that very quickly in that last sentence about me as a Jew, as a people, who we are, and exploring that side of identity and how it connects to faith. Obviously, amidst all of your studies for the last few years, it's been an interesting, time for you where your army service was going back and forth between the yeshiva, the seminary, and the army. And then after you're out of the army and you're in university, a war breaks out, and then you're going back and forth from the battlefield to the classroom and, writing papers and going back to the battlefield. So it's been this oscillation, this back and forth between spiritual, development and introspection about these big ideas and being involved in the military. That's really what your life has been for the last, for the last 6-7 years. It's been like that for a long time. Can you talk about this, about that exact issue, about how this journey, this intellectual journey, and trying to understand and faith and making it all fit together in the theology, how did that inform what took place on the battlefield? How was it informed by what took place on the battlefield for you?
Mm-hmm. So before I answer that, I'm just going to frame what you said about going back and forth to the battlefield and studying. In Israel, everyone joins the military, right? We're a small country. We need a lot of soldiers. Everyone joins the military. And there is a program where instead of going straight off to the army, you go to seminary. And then after a couple years in the seminary, you go to the army and then you return to the seminary. So that's the first sort of back and forth. And then the second back and forth is now during the war, I was in university when the war started. And because I'm in reserves, so I wasn't just going to be in the field the whole war through. So I would be in the field for 2 or 3 months, and then I'd go back to university for 2 or 3 months and try to catch up and do as much as I could, and then head back out into the field. So basically, I said that I've spent the past 10 years or so working on these issues, but it's been really only half the time because it's always been back and forth with the military. And I think the most impactful thing about that is that the military is a very intense experience. That's not surprising. That goes without saying, but it hits especially hard when we want to take these big issues in our lives seriously. We want to say, okay, what am I about? And what is my faith about? And what's important to me? And when we have so much going on, and it doesn't have to be war, it can be anything, but especially war and especially the military, we get busy very fast. And it's very hard to find time for those things. On the other hand, it really hammers home, and this is much more powerful in my experience, really hammers home how high the stakes are. That if we don't know where we stand and we don't take our lives seriously, then it matters a lot, right? In war, the stakes are high and we really have to know where we stand. And so these issues of what it means to me to be a man of faith, or what it means to me to be a Jew, or what it means to me to connect to Christians, those aren't academic. That doesn't end in the study hall where I'm sitting in an air-conditioned room and studying it, because I'm constantly going out into the world and doing high stakes stuff and then heading back into the study hall and out and in and out and in. And it really drives home that I have to come to an understanding of these issues.
You said earlier that you've really discovered or come to appreciate how much we have in common, Christians and Jews. And obviously, that's not true for all Christians and all Jews. I get there's a spectrum of belief, a spectrum of practice, all of that. But Pesach and I have said over the years that, there's so much. You put it as the bridge is not that you're not crossing this huge chasm. It's really close. What were some of those things that you felt were similar? What were some of those items on your list that you went, oh, wow, that we're pretty close on that?
So I'm sure there's a lot. If we tried to run through it, we'd come up with many things. I think the most important thing, though, that's sort of a prerequisite to all the other things that we have in common is understanding that we're not competing. And for me, that was a big realization that I came to, because especially when I was young and I was trying to figure out what my religion was about. So there's sort of this attitude of, if I'm right, then whoever doesn't agree with me is wrong. And as my faith matured, I would say, and as I came to a broader understanding, I realized that I'm not competing with anyone else. That doesn't mean that anything goes, but what it means is that I don't have to shun anyone who isn't exactly in my square. And when you meet people from across the aisle or who are slightly different, who also have that attitude, that's really what allows the similarities to flourish. So that isn't a similarity per se, but it's really what has to be in place for any of this to happen. That we understand that we're not saying you're wrong, but I'll play along and just try to make the most of it. And I'm also not saying you're wrong and I'll try to fix you, but really realizing to the degree to which we're really on the same team.
Yeah, I like the way you
often
put that.
said It's really good. I often say to friends, across the aisle, or as I've built relationships with Jews, honestly, I didn't enter a synagogue for the first time until after I went to Israel. I had never been to a Shabbat dinner. I had no context for any of this space that I've been occupying the last 10 years. And now I'm going to move my 4 kids, my wife, and we're going to live in Israel. And we count it such a huge privilege. Everybody's excited, anticipatory, and I'm sure it's going to have its hurdles and it's going to have its moments and there's going to be misunderstandings and all of that. But at the end of the day, I need Pesach to be Pesach. I don't need him to be anything other than that. And he asked me to be Doug, and I tell him all the time, I'm a better Christian and a better pastor because of my relationship with him. I've learned so much about my own faith. And I think when you approach it as it's me versus me, I'm trying to figure my journey out, my lane out. I have to make decisions for my household. It becomes a different game when I'm trying to fix everybody else, or I'm trying to navigate everybody else. But if I'm just worried about, hey, I got to take care of me, and I get to be as authentic as I can be. And in these relationships, these beautiful things happen, because then you can be friends with anybody at that point. You can, cross the aisle. You can have differing opinions, and there's a richness that comes to life that you don't get when you're just in an echo chamber in a bubble.
Exactly.
Yeah, Mayor, when we were in the U.S., and I encourage everyone again, if you haven't seen it yet, to go over to the YouTube channel and watch Mayor's speech at the church in Harker Heights. It's really fantastic. And, and for someone who hasn't done a lot of public speaking yet, it was really outstanding, really, very, very polished.
He has some similarities to someone on this podcast. So
really?
There were a few mannerisms. Oh, he did 1 or 2 mannerisms. I went, oh, Pesach does that. I was like, that's really good.
We must be related.
Yes,
we must. Exactly. Well, Mayor, I want to go down, a little bit of the road that we were talking about, and some of it came out in your speech, and some of it came out on the podcast. We recorded a podcast, the Under God podcast, that is sometimes hosted by Pastor Stephen Martin and Pastor Nate Brown, and they, depending on who's there, Pastor Stephen was actually away while we were there, and Pastor Nate hosted the podcast, and we had a fantastic discussion. And Mayor, in that discussion, you were talking about some of the stuff that's gone on in the Gaza Strip. So I want to get off of the bigger picture things we've been talking about now, because I think it's valuable to address some of these things. And Pastor and Nate asked about the whole issue of civilian casualties and things that you see, and all the charges that Israel is out there killing children. And you made a really interesting point, just sharing your own experience about how the tactics that Israel employs play out and what they mean strategically. Can you just talk about that charge that Israeli soldiers are targeting civilians?
Yeah, so this comes up all the time, and there are a few ways of approaching it. As someone who reads that and says, no way, how do I argue with that? So one way to argue with it, and we see this happening, is to bring the numbers, right? If we're accused of something, so let's see how many people have been killed, when, how old were they, what were the situations? And although I agree, or I firmly believe that the numbers do affirm the Israeli side of the story, big numbers are always hard to grasp. So when we're talking about thousands of people, tens of thousands, yes, it's over the course of years and populations of millions. It's very hard for people to be convinced by arguments like that. All you need is one picture to do away with any statistical conversation. So even though the statistical conversation is very important, I'm going to set it aside. Also because I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it's really because anyone who wants to see the numbers and discussions that dive deep into that, there are other places to do that. I would encourage people to search online and try to find resources about it. But what I would want to focus on is what I saw personally as someone on the ground, which again, it's anecdotal, but that's the side where I can bring something maybe fresh to the story, other than the stats that you can find if you search for them. So from what I saw and from what I experienced, I would say a number of things. First of all, and most importantly, as Israeli soldiers, by large, because there are always going to be crazy people on the fringes, but in general, we really care about the civilians, whether it's the civilians in Lebanon or the civilians in Gaza. And we genuinely believe, again, most of us genuinely believe that if we manage to pull off what we have set out to do, that their lives will be better. We're not just fighting this war for us, we're fighting this war for the world, I guess you could say, but really for them as well. We think that they'll be better off if we win. Now, it's tricky because they don't think that. So how do we convince them? But that's a different story. We genuinely care about them. And when we see them and we see what they're going through, they're having a tough time, right? Just because they lie all the time in the news and they make things up, even if they're not starving to death, it's no fun to have a war going on. And when you're on the ground and you see that, we weren't raised to be happy when we see things like that. It's supposed to be jarring. That speaks well of us. But that also speaks to how important the work that we're doing is. And we genuinely believe that we're willing to do all that work to better their lives and to better ours. That's what we want. We really care about them. And maybe that sounds weird to some people because in a war, you're fighting. So why would you say you care about the other side? But on the ground, we actually do. And that goes very far because someone could say, okay, you're fighting a war and you say you care, but ultimately it doesn't matter that you say you care because then you go out and you fight a war. But the fact that we care about them actually fundamentally changes the way we're fighting this war. Because anytime we are set to enter a certain area, whether in Lebanon or in Gaza, we let everyone know. We send text messages, we drop leaflets from the sky, we have drones with loudspeakers, anything we can do to let them know we're coming in here. If you're not a combatant, leave. Now, it's what we have to do if we don't want the civilians to be there, but it's important to recognize how fundamentally this is from a tactical standpoint, because maybe the number one rule of fighting a war is preserving the element of surprise. Attack your enemy.
It's going to be incredibly dangerous.
Yeah. So attack the enemy when they don't expect it, where they don't expect it. And here we're telling the enemy exactly where and when we're going to be attacking. So the civilians leave, but the enemy digs in and he's extra ready. And that's a price that we're willing to pay to protect these civilians. We're making our tactical situation so much worse. We could have said, we're not willing to pay that price. We need to preserve our soldiers. We're not going to give up that massive tactical advantage. And if more civilians die, that's a shame. They should clear out on their own. But we take all that time and we defer attacks and we wait around and things drag on and we don't enter an area until they're gone. So I think that's one of maybe a few examples, but that really hammers home that not only do we say, oh, we care about them, but our actions speak much louder than our words do. And our actions are significant. We give up the element of surprise. We tell the enemy exactly when and where we're going to attack so that we can preserve as many civilian lives as possible.
And I've seen that repeatedly. I've had a number of IDF soldiers over the last several years since the war began speak at the church and done different, they've been on this podcast and a number of other arenas. And several of them have showed me, private pictures and different things where they took care of children and animals and all sorts of compassion that they had to show on the field where, your adrenaline's pumping. You're in the midst of a battle, and to turn that switch on and off for combatant versus non-combatant has to be incredibly challenging. But repeatedly, across ages, genders, all of that. I've talked to all sorts of folks serving in the IDF. That has been the repeated message of all of them. And they've shown numerous pictures and videos. And I commend you and all the IDF soldiers for having to fight in those conditions, because your enemy does not want to fight fairly. They want to fight in the midst of civilians, and they want civilian casualties, which is why you're in the predicament that you're in.
Yeah, I just want to hammer home part of what I said, because as I mentioned, we're not talking about the big stats here, And if I feel bad about doing something, or me and my friends have compassion for the Gazans, well, okay, that's anecdotal. But here, what we talked about giving up the element of surprise, that's official government and military policy. That's how the Israeli government and the Israeli military run. So that's not anecdotal anymore. Now, again, there are isolated incidents, all sorts of things happen. It's a war. If we had 10 hours of podcast, we could break everything down. But really, it's important to realize that as policy, we give up a lot to save lives on the other side.
Yeah, that's such an important point. You know, I wanted you to repeat that because when I heard you say it the other day, and I watched this war as closely as anybody, I'd never even thought about that obvious point that giving up the element of surprise is such it seems absolutely self-defeating. And everyone knows that Israel does drop the leaflets and make the cell phone calls and make the announcements of where they're striking. And that should be just number one on people's list, that it's not only, and everyone knows that they do that. People talk about the fact that they do that as though it's some humanitarian act, but it goes beyond being a humanitarian act. It's also self-defeating from a tactical perspective. And that makes it all the more remarkable. And I think everyone listening should add that to your bag of tools for standing around the water cooler at work. Next time someone says that Israel's committing genocide, make that point, that they actually harm their own. They actually harm. Israel actually takes a loss, as it were, on the tactical front in order to preserve the lives of these citizens who, like you said, actually are not on our side. And, you know, let me ask you a question, Mayor.
But
Obviously,
Pesach,
when you guys were out there,
Pesach, before you ask that question, I think it's even deeper than that, because it's not just the element of surprise. I'm sure that there are lives of soldiers that are attached to it. It's not just a tactical disadvantage. Well, it is, but I'm sure that the enemy, in its preparation, it's cost Israeli soldiers their lives to preserve the civilians. It's a high price to pay. It's not just a strategic disadvantage, but you're talking about blood. And I think that's and to me, I think that's even a stronger case and point that we're willing to sacrifice some of our own soldiers to preserve the life of people that don't even like that we're there in the first place, and don't care that we want to preserve their own lives.
Mayor, yeah, I mean, look, you know, Doug, that also obviously raises the ethical issue about should we even be going this far, and what is the just thing to do? But certainly in terms of defending against the attackers who accuse Israel of war crimes, this should certainly be an argument that's at the top of the list. Now, Mayor, I just want to, continue down this rabbit hole a little bit. You know, you talked about thinking about the big picture and thinking about what we're doing and how war brings things into focus, and you need to know what you're fighting for. You need to know what you believe in. Take me into the room a little bit about, conversations that you guys had when you're out there, because I imagine not everyone's done this type of philosophical or existential homework that you did before going in. Take us behind the curtain, behind the scenes of, I'm sure guys were talking about these issues when you're in there. What do you think the sentiment was among the guys about the way Israel fights this? It has been fighting the war, about these types of decisions that Israel has made.
So the first thing I would say is the good news is these conversations happen all the time. And I think that's a big sign of having a healthy environment, and also people who these issues are important to them. In the military, anyone who's been in the military, but anyone who's watched a movie about the military knows you do what you're told. And we do what we're told, but that makes it all the more powerful if, while we're doing what we're told, we're also raising questions and trying to figure things out. So these conversations happen all the time. And I'll bring one example to sort of tie it into a broad issue that often gets brought up. So we mentioned these civilians that we want them to clear out of areas, and sometimes we'll take advantage of that. If there's a pocket of population in a certain area, we'll tell them to leave, and we'll have them go down a certain path. And as they walk that path, we'll have people watching who can pick out terrorists who are trying to get away, right? So we're standing there. I don't know how to recognize any terrorists. That's not my job, but we're sort of, guarding the periphery, and we have the special intelligence soldiers who are there to make sure no terrorists take advantage of this humanitarian step. So we see everyone walking by, and the women and children are going through, obviously, and also even fighting age males who are just non-combatants. And something that came up a lot with people in my unit, or something that hit them very hard, was seeing kids who were the same age as their kids. Because that's always very powerful. And people saying, well, here I am in Gaza fighting, and I have a 5-year-old son at home, and there's a 5-year-old there. If we fast forward 20 years, are they going to be fighting each other? And that's not really a philosophical question as much as a strategic question of, okay, how do we prevent that? And how do we make sure that what we're doing is solution focused and actually get somewhere? Now, we hope it'll get somewhere. And if we got our way, yes, it would be solved. But maybe the biggest overarching issue is, how do we make sure we actually solve the problems here? So I think that's something that hits people very hard, again, when they see children and then they think of the children back home, and is this just going to be one round after the other? Frankly, the way it has been until now, in a sense. So that's just one example of a very heavy type of conversation that people have. They see something, they say, whoa, they take a step back and they discuss it. And I think that's a very, very good sign of a healthy group of people or a healthy society, that we discuss those things and we say, okay, wait a minute, maybe I wasn't thinking about the long-term solution as much. I was thinking short-term about how do we neutralize these threats? How do we make things calm down? But I see children, I think of my children at home. Okay, I have to be thinking more long-term than I was. So I don't have the long-term solutions, but that's just an example of the types of conversations that sort of sprout up organically when we see things out there.
We started this conversation talking about your faith and inspiration and going to churches. And so I kind of want to finish with one kind of final question. One of the statistics that I'm seeing kind of across the board is a lot of young Israelis are returning to their faith. They seem to be getting more spiritual, across the board. They're perhaps going and keeping Shabbat for the first time, or they're going to shul, or they're wrapping tefillin. What has been your experience on the ground in Israel amongst your friends? Are people returning to faith in God? Are they just doing it out of tradition? Is it genuine? What are you seeing on the ground? I know what the statistics are saying. I've read the articles, but what do you see?
So what I see is there's definitely a strengthening of faith, but I think it's happening in a very maybe unique way. Because as Jewish Zionist people of faith, our nationhood and our religion, it's really pretty much the same thing. We see that when we read the Bible and the people of Israel, it's a nation, it's a religion, it's all of the above. And now that the exiles have come together and we're in the land of Israel, we have our own nation, and it's the Jewish nation, those things really fit together. And in a war, we're not just fighting as a nation against groups of outsiders who want to harm us and have harmed us. We're also fighting for our faith in a way. They want to kill us because they view us as infidels. And we wouldn't have started a war to kill people of another religion, but the religious undercurrents, or even more than undercurrents, are very strong here. So these two sides of the Jewish people, the nationhood and the faith, they really blend together. And especially in a time of war, everything comes to the surface. So I think people's connection to, I guess we could call it faith, but in this broadest possible sense, their connection to the land, their connection to the nation, to the people of Israel, to the historical developments that have brought the Jewish people thus far, looking forward, where do we want to be? What's the Jewish people about? How do we want this story to keep going? How do we want it to end? These big picture, national, religious, faith-based ideas are very, very present. And for some people, it's more faith heavy, and for some people, it's more nationalism heavy. But it's really all the same kind of discussion, and it's just been thick in the air for a few years now, and it's very special.
Well, this has been an incredible conversation. It's so nice to meet you. God willing, I'll get to meet you in person. Maybe we'll get to do Shabbat together at some point, and look forward to being with you some point in Israel. But it's been a pleasure to have you on here shoulder to shoulder today.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was great.
And thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, rate, share this podcast. Come on over to Patreon, subscribe to our Facebook page and Facebook group, stop by on YouTube, as we would love to connect with more and more of our Shoulder to Shoulder family. And we'll see you on our next episode.